Alkatawatok, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific, meaning Koroi Hawkins. Coming up, Marshall Islands call for an independent assessment of Fukushima wastewater release.
Marshall Islands didn't feel that we could change the decision that has been made by Forum, but we could at the same time express our opinion.
Grim plights in store for people evicted from PNG squatter settlements.
More than 700 households which got evicted by order of court.
And later on, we hear from a researcher who has found climate change is already a consideration for families relocating in Tonga and Samoa. The Marshall Islands is calling for an independent Pacific body to review the release of treated nuclear wastewater from Fukushima into the Pacific Ocean. The president says it's important given the country's unique burden of radioactive contamination from United States nuclear bomb tests. Caleb Fotheringham was in the Marshall Islands and filed this report.
In August last year, Japan began discharging contaminated water collected after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that caused the Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown. The Marshall Islands is worried about the release. However, the nation's president, Hilda Heine, still joined other Pacific countries last month to recognise the views of the International Atomic Energy Authority, which says the water is safe.
Marshall Islands didn't feel that we could change the decision that has been made by Forum, but we could at the same time express our opinion.
President Heine says the Marshall Islands is calling for an independent Pacific body to review the release. Meanwhile, Pacific Islands Forum Chair Mark Brown maintains the discharge does not go against the spirit of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, with Japan meeting all required international standards.
There's no contravention in this because the water is being treated and cleaned and the isotopes are being removed before this water is discharged into the ocean.
New Zealand's Foreign Minister Winston Peters says he does not have a view on a separate Pacific group reviewing the release.
We don't go walk off and have our own opinion in the Pacific. We listen to the people, we connect with them and understand their concerns and try and come to a united view, and that's where we're heading for now, on that very issue.
Kenneth Keddy is a former MP for Rongelap Atoll, one of the atolls worst affected by the nuclear tests. He says his people have already had too much radiation exposure and they shouldn't have to risk any more.
If it's clean, why not just keep it in Japan, in a silo under a mountain somewhere? Dig a silo and put them there. Why dump them into the Pacific Ocean?
The radiation from US nuclear testing resulted in health problems that still persist in the Marshall Islands, like high rates of cancer. The United States has a special relationship with the Marshall Islands with the Compact of Free Association, which gives the US military access to the country in return for financial aid. Despite this, Mr. Keddy says the US has never apologized.
We consider them as special and unique friends. We even refer to them sometimes as family members, bigger brothers and sisters. Apology cannot be granted? Just simply said, we made a mistake.
He says if the US wants to make amends, it should clear the radiation off the atolls and pay the outstanding nuclear claims.
A Papua New Guinea human rights lawyer says hundreds of people are still living on the streets of Port Moresby 2 years after being evicted from a squatter settlement. More than 11,000 people were forced out of the Morata New Block settlement in 2022 after a court decision. Lawyer Danny Gonal spoke with Don Wiseman and told him about their plight.
To the people I'm representing, a little over 11,000. More than 700 households which got evicted by order of court. The district court in Port Moresby issued eviction orders. Those orders were appealed to the National Court and eventually to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court confirmed the eviction orders issued by the Port Moresby District Court, upon which orders the people were evicted on the 12th of October 2022.
So since they've been evicted, have any of them found property that they can definitely call their own?
Those who were able to afford, they moved into accommodation they could afford. The others who were unable to afford it and they're living on the streets of Port Moresby, yes.
How many would be living on the streets?
A little over 700 families. About 700 families were evicted, so many of them have been unemployed or either they were self-employed. And finding alternative accommodation in Port Moresby is very expensive. So I cannot give the exact number, but more than 300 families are affected. I think they're still looking for homes.
Have any gone back to their provinces?
Some of them have gone back to their provinces. Many still living in Port Moresby.
Well, your people are incensed that the government has provided money for the Bushwara settlers who were removed last month, but there was no money provided for the people from the Marauta New Block.
The Bushwara settlement is a few kilometers away from Marauta settlement. So the government, through the Ministry of Lands, only announced that 20 million kina would be provided for resettlement purposes, but that money is not yet forthcoming. And I think there would be certain criteria which the settlers have to meet before they're entitled to those monies. But that was only an announcement made. So we put forward the situation the Marauta settlers are in, so that could be included as well in that proposal for resettlement.
20 million kina is not going to go far among tens of thousands of people, is it?
Yes, that is the amount that has been announced, but whether that is adequate to resettle all of those people who are affected is another issue.
Yes. What needs to happen, Danny, in your view? Clearly, it can't go on like this, can it? Regular evictions from settlements.
Yes. In Papua New Guinea, the laws we have, title is conclusive proof of ownership, and we have a Westminster system of democracy. At one stage, the government passed a legislation called Vagrancy Act, that is to stop people from coming into urban centers from the villages. And that law was brought to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. Unconstitutional because the Constitution of Papua New Guinea provides for freedom of movement. So that law was to restrict the movement of people, and the people, if they're citizens, they have a right to live wherever they want to within Papua New Guinea.
Now, just to go back to this, the letter that you have written to John Rosso, who's also the Minister of Lands, I think, saying that the New Marauta people expected to be included in that 20 million kina. Have you heard back from him?
No, we have written to him. We have yet to receive a response from John Rosso, the Minister for Lands. And he's also the Deputy Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea.
In terms of resolving the issues, there's a lot of land in Papua New Guinea, isn't there? And a lot more could be done with it if the government was better organised. Is that fair?
Yes. If you look at the land system we have in Papua New Guinea, about 97% of the land are customary land, and only 3% alienated land, meaning it is state land. So the land on which the settlers in Marauta were evicted is part of the 3% of land in the country. And so our position is that the government fails because through the National Housing Commission, adequate housing should be provided for all citizens. And that is not the case. So what happens now, people come from the village settings in search of employment in the cities, including Port Moresby. And when they come, they find no housing. So people could have whatever accommodation they can put. So that is what happened in this scenario.
You're a lawyer, of course, so it's caveat emptor, isn't it? If people are buying land off someone who claims to own it, it behoves them to find out just whether, in fact, those people are the owners. It's their failing, the settlers failing, if they buy land from people who are ripping them off.
Most of the land in Port Moresby are vacant land. It's land originally owned by customary landowners from the central province. Now it's a national capital district. So many people feel that they still own the land under customary ownership. And they did not realize that those lands were converted to state lists. So that is the problem we have here. And those original customary landowners sell the land to other people, other Papua New Guineans who wish to settle on those vacant land. And that is the case in this matter now.
So are you expecting a positive outcome here?
Yes, I am the lawyer acting for the settlers in the Marauta case, which is similar to the Bushwara issue. We've already given notice to the state to sue for damages. In this case, there was a company was issued. For the Maratha case, there was a company called Sixth Estate Limited who was issued a title over that land. And the people were already settling on that land. So the court found that because the company had title, the court ordered eviction against the settlers. And so we have submitted that the company may have the legal right, but the people living on that land and the owners of the land, including the state, did not say anything over the years. They put up improvements, so they acquired what is called an equitable right. And the equitable right is not as strong as a legal right, but as far as compensation to relocation issues are concerned, they're entitled to.
Compensation for the loss of their equitable rights.
Compensation for the properties they put up, or the eviction affected. So some of those settlers put up permanent structures and they were dismantled, pulled down. So we are taking that issue to the national court, either for them to be compensated or for them to be relocated, as a responsibility to find land elsewhere to relocate those affected.
And that's a separate issue from the wanting to be tagged with this 20 million kina allocation. And that, how close are you to getting to court over that?
We already gave what is called a Section 5 notice, and that is a notice registering my client's interest to sue the state to recover for the losses they incurred as a result of that eviction. And if that is not done, the next possibility is to have them relocated. Relocation, land has to be located and land has to be identified, and that is impossible at this stage.
A Tongan researcher in Aotearoa has found climate-forced relocation is already well underway in Tonga and Samoa. Waikato University's Laura Violetti found a lot of people who were planning short-term moves to places like Australia and New Zealand just to earn enough money to then move back home and rebuild on land less vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. She says most of the people she talked to did not want to move, but wanted practical hands-on support to help them adapt to climate change impacts. Laura Violetti spoke with RNZ Pacific reporter Grace Fiavai about the research.
We're grateful that MSAT made that commitment to have this research being Pacific-led, but also it brought up some really interesting insights in Tonga and in Samoa. People obviously don't want to move. They want real practical hands-on support as well.
What are some findings that came up in your research?
We've found that climate change mobility is already happening, even though the stories that we hear in the media is often about places like Kiribati or Tuvalu, in places like Tonga and in Samoa, but to a lesser degree. We know that climate change-related mobility is already happening. We know that it has happened in the last 5 years or so, and we know that people are planning to move because of climate change in the coming 5 years because of the impacts of climate change, and at an increased rate.
What were some of those impacts?
We also noted, very interestingly, it was something that was one of our key findings, was that people who are planning mobility because of climate change in Tonga, they were planning to move within Tonga, were also in parallel planning to move to places like New Zealand. We found this in survey, and we didn't know why, so we managed to follow up some people from the survey and found that there were families who may have a piece of land in another place in Tonga and a higher piece of land, but they didn't have the funding to build on that land. And so what they were actually doing was they had a longer-term process where they were moving within Tonga, but because they didn't have access to sufficient income within Tonga, they were actually planning a 10 to 15-year stay in New Zealand to raise that income in order to build a home in a different location in Tonga. So we described this as kind of a dual mobility process that was happening because of climate change in Tonga. So we noticed that link between internal mobility and overseas mobility that was climate change related in Tonga. And we also saw hints of that in Samoa to a lesser degree.
What were some of those plans or reasons for people to move?
Careful to note that even though we see very high numbers of people reporting plans to move, whether that's within Tonga or within Samoa and overseas, relatively high numbers of people were reporting these plans to move. But when we talked to them in person, we noted, as I mentioned earlier, that the plans weren't necessarily forever. Sometimes it was a short 5, 10 or 15-year stint overseas in order to educate their children, save up money to enable them in their goals back in Tonga and Samoa.
What do the people of Samoa and Tonga want from this research or in general?
Broader, deeper awareness programs, but particularly ongoing. And so people are really looking for something more consistent and something ongoing that they can kind of rely on, I suppose, a little bit more. We hear climate change this, climate change that. There's a flurry of activity and then it's done.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. Thanks to us from Mifalahia lo RNZ Pacific. Luki Mifala next time more.